Let's get some analysis. Much needed, of course. Mark Garnett from Lancaster University up in the northwest of England, where he is the senior lecturer there in politics. Mark, good evening to you. Mr Corbyn has criticised Mrs May's consultations with other key figures in the other parties as, and I'm quoting now, a PR sham. He went on to say there's no flexibility, no negotiations, nothing has changed. Do you agree with Mr Corbyn?
Well, I wouldn't use his language, but at the same time, it was always difficult to see how this would lead anywhere. Mrs May has insisted that her deal is the only compromise that's available, and the only way of getting any change from that compromise seems to be very marginal changes, maybe forms of words rather than anything really binding. So although one would say that it's a kind of exercise that might give the country confidence that the Prime Minister is listening, it was always possible that somebody would say, I'm not going to talk to anyone who really isn't prepared to move. So although Mrs May seem to think that in a way she's made Mr Corbyn look uncooperative, I don't think people are going to be terribly impressed with that kind of point scoring. So I think it's fair to say that the exercise was stillborn. It was certainly not a fruitful exercise.
Indeed, and that idea of the no deal, which Corbyn wanted off the table, the other key figures from the opposition parties wanted that same thing, didn't they? So kind of a unity there in the opposition ranks in that sense. Do you get a feeling that what Mrs May is doing now effectively is a filibuster and trying to sort of basically kick the can down the line and just hope that this deal eventually gets voted through by attrition, to put it that way?
Yes. Well, this is right. I mean, I think that really one can only say she's trying to grind down her opponents in the House of Commons. And to an extent, this is sort of working with the public. I hear increasingly people saying we should get on with something, and all the other options that the Remainers and those who want a softer Brexit, these things are all things which seem to require time, and time is something Mrs May might regard that time is her best weapon. The thing is that she's been kicking that can. It's a very long road, and the can has got a lot of dents in it now, and one begins to think that she must be running out of time, but the overwhelming kind of wave of public opinion in her favour doesn't seem to be coming. The country is still divided. And I think that we've always been waiting, in the last few weeks anyway, for something big to happen. And Amber Rudd's comment, I think, tonight, I think this is a very significant statement. I think this is the kind of big thing that might well happen, that people are losing patience with Mrs May, and that even if she isn't going to grant a second referendum, she should at least take no deal off the table. And the reason for that is people say it's a negotiating tactic. But I think for most people watching this process, it's been clear from the start that the EU has set out its negotiating position. It thinks that this is a clear and logical position. It isn't game playing or power game. And therefore, really, to talk of negotiating tactics on the British side seems to miss the whole point of what's been going on. And it would, in fact, be rather worrying for people watching this closely if Mrs May was still thinking about bargaining chips. It's getting far too serious for that kind of thing.
Indeed. On the one hand, there's Amber Rudd, as you just said, former Home Secretary, now Works and Pensions Secretary, who said that there could be mass resignations from May's cabinet if lawmakers are forced to vote for a situation which takes no deal, which makes no deal not possible. Let me get that correct. But on the other hand, there are other members of the Conservative Party who would happily see a disorderly Brexit, rubbing their hands almost in glee at the possibility. In your opinion, what would a no-deal Brexit mean for the country going forward, for the people of Britain?
Well, this is a question which, on one side, people seem to think that because during the referendum campaign, those who spoke of this situation were accused of exaggerating the consequences. I think there are a lot of people on the Leave side who think that fear, Project Fear, is still going on, and that one way or another, Britain would get through a temporary problem. And a lot of these people think that it would be a lot worse for the EU. The EU has got more to lose than Britain. The EU needs Britain more than Britain needs the EU. Now, I think that exposes the underlying position that Leavers have held throughout the whole of this process during the referendum and beyond. And the problem for those who think that this really will be a catastrophe for the British economy, they don't really want to be proved to be right. And what you were saying before about Amber Rudd's comments about people resigning, there is in the House of Commons a majority which will not, if it can possibly help it, allow this experiment of Britain leaving without a deal. They won't allow this to happen. And what Mrs. Rudd is saying this evening is that we're prepared to go to quite extreme lengths to make sure this experiment is never tried. One way or another, it does seem to me that the House of Commons does have the power to stop a no-deal Brexit. We're beginning to see, I think, now the troops getting into line for that battle.
Mark Garnett, as ever, thank you, sir, for joining us. Mark Garnett from Lancaster University in the northwest of England, where he's a senior lecturer, as you could hear there, in politics. And